Hey guys, welcome to another video in my series of videos over the Shadow of Innistrad expansion in terms of limited. So far we've covered the best commons and uncommons in each color. Yesterday we covered the best rares and mythics that you want to open. Today we're sort of looking at the opposite end of things, and we're going to look at 10 cards that you should never play. These are sort of based on sort of the power level of the cards and also based on cards that I'm used to seeing people play in other formats that I don't really think they should be playing. And that's what this list will be. I do kind of have a disclaimer about what this list isn't. What it isn't is a list of cards like these that are rare, that are pretty clearly not playable in limited. Brain in a Jar, just an excessive amount of mana to pay for a minor effect. And Harness the Storm, there might be some strange case where you manage to draft a bunch of copies of a really good instant or sorcery spell, but it's probably not going to happen. This list is only commons and uncommons, the kind of cards that you'll see a lot of, but that I don't think you should be putting in your decks, and I'll explain why about each of them when we get to them. I do have one dishonorable mention, mostly because I ended up with 11 cards, and 11's not a round number, and that is Groundskeeper. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with an ability, which is the kind of card that people sometimes end up being attracted to, just because, that seems like it passes the vanilla test, but it really doesn't. 1-mana 1/1s have a limited effect on the game, and they have to do something really special to be worth playing, and Groundskeeper doesn't. It can return basic land cards from your graveyard to your hand, so I think the attraction here would be that if you have some self-milling stuff going on, especially in the green-black deck, you could get back a land if you really needed it, but that's a lot of mana to pay just to get a land back from your graveyard, and it's just not really going to be worth it most of the time. You'll draw a land, for a 0-mana investment, and you don't need to be spending 2 mana to get a land back from your graveyard, especially because sometimes you need that land for Delirium anyway. So onward we go to number 10, which is Chaplain's Blessing. This is sort of a classic example of a card that just isn't worth a card. You don't want this card in your deck because it doesn't do enough. You do pay 1 white and gain 5 life, which is a decent-ish rate for life gain. If the card replaced itself, it'd be very playable, actually, but it doesn't. It just uses up a card and gives you 5 life. Saying never about this card is a little excessive, I'll admit, but it is a card that I think people will overplay. But you should only side this in if there ends up being a very aggressive deck in the format, that a card like Chaplain's Blessing, which gains you 5 life, is effectively a counterspell. But the problem is, this kind of card, which can be a counterspell and constructed against burn, isn't as good in limited because there's not going to be a dedicated burn deck. There's not such a thing in this format. So 99.9% of the time, Chaplain's Blessing is not going to be a good sideboard card. So most of the time, you don't want to play it. Then at number 9, in a similar vein, we have Alms of the Vein. 3 mana, target opponent loses 3 life, you gain 3 life, and it has Madness for 1 black. I think the thing that's going to attract people here is sort of comparisons to Lightning Helix. The thing people need to remember about Lightning Helix is that Lightning Helix actually damages creatures as well if you needed to. It's a removal spell that gains you life. Alms of the Vein can only dome your opponent, and thus is effectively most of the time going to be a waste of a card unless it's actually killing your opponent. Even then, there are better ways you can do it. The madness on this, for the opponent loses 3, you gain 3, is, going to be what attracts people, especially in the black-red vampires deck. But I still don't think it's worth the play. I would advise putting it in your deck basically always. So onward we go to number 8, another black card, Creeping Dread. I am uncertain as to why they printed this card. It's a pretty cool card for maybe interesting commanders or something, but it's a bad card all around, and I think most people will recognize that, but just in case I have it on here. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player discards a card that includes you. Each opponent who discarded a card that shares a card type with the card you discarded loses 3 life. Okay, so it seems like it would be good to have a symmetrical discard effect, especially if you're the one who's playing a Madness deck. But the problem is every deck has Madness cards, so your opponent can manipulate this pretty well. Maybe not as effectively as you can if you think you can fit Creeping Dread into your deck. But the other problem with the card is it has 0 impact on the board. Enchantments that don't impact the board at all, especially not immediately, are very bad. And this one never affects the board. It can potentially cause your opponent to lose some life, but you can also be potentially allowing them to cast their Madness spells. Even if you're getting to cast your Madness spells off of this, Creeping Dread's still not going to be worth it most of the time, and I would definitely advise against playing this overcosted enchantment. At number 7, I have Runaway Carriage. This is a card that I think people will be attracted to in terms of trying to get their Delirium going. The important thing to note in general about artifact creatures in this format is that they have two creatures, two types, so their count is half of Delirium, and that's quite nice. But there are better playable artifact creatures, and Runaway Carriage is not one of them. For 4 mana, you do get a 5/6 trample. Obviously, that knocks the vanilla test out of the park, but if it does anything, including attacking or blocking, you have to sacrifice it at the end of combat. So the thing that'll attract people, as I said, is that it's a quick way to get half of Delirium filled, since it sacrifices itself, but you're still basically down a card that probably did very little on the board, and there's better ways to get Delirium than Runaway Carriage, and you just don't want to be drafting this. Leave this card for someone else to pick up as, the 15th card to get in a pack, and don't take it yourself. Onward we go to number 6. Every time I do one of these top 10 lists, I end up having one slide that's basically bad auras. This is because people play auras all the time in Limited that are not worth playing, basically. Most auras in Limited aren't worth playing, I'll tell you that. Only the very good ones are cards like Knightly Valor, which was in Magic Origins, 4 and a white. Put it on a creature, that creature gets +2/+2 in Vigilance, and it puts a 2/2 Knight with Vigilance into play. You do have to wait for your opponent to not have removal to cast this, but the thing that's nice about it is if your opponent only has removal after you play the Valor, you don't end up with nothing. You at least have your 2/2 Knight with Vigilance, right? But the problem with all of these auras is that you end up with nothing if they play a removal spell, even if they don't do it in response to you playing it, which feels even worse because you immediately get 2-for-1. They're going to 2-for-1 you eventually if your opponent's deck has a decent amount of removal. I would also say, again, that saying never is a little bit excessive with these, because sometimes if you're playing an opponent who seems to have next to no removal, sometimes siding these in can be good, but some of them are just terrible. Hope Against Hope is an incredibly bad card, as is Equestrian Skill, which is really disappointing because they're supposed to be cards to support the green-white human archetype, and they just don't. They're auras, they're not worth playing. Hope Against Hope asks for too much, and Equestrian Skill is overcosted. By asking for too much, I mean it wants you to have numerous creatures in play when you play it to be any good to begin with. Senseless Rage is probably one of the better on this list, if I had to pick one, because it does give a fairly large bonus for what it costs, and it even has Madness, which means you can get it into play at instant speed and have it effectively be a combat trick, but you're still opening yourself up to a 2-for-1 down the road, and I don't really think it's worth it. Ghostly Wings is another one that if I'm going to be wrong about, maybe it's Ghostly Wings. I think people will be attracted to it a little excessively, though, because it can enable Madness, and it can act as a bounce spell. But the problem is if you don't have a card with Madness, you're 2-for-1ing yourself, and not even, it's more like 2-for-halving yourself, because your opponent just gets the card bounced to their hand. You can also use it on your own creatures, of course, to manipulate enter the battlefield abilities, but you still open yourself up to numerous 2-for-1s, especially if you discard the card and your opponent uses a removal spell. Spiteful Motives is an interesting one because it has Flash, so it can sort of be a combat trick. But we just recently had Sure Strike, which costs half of this and does the same thing until end of turn, and is definitely a better card because it costs half, whereas Spiteful Motives costs an entire 4 and is just not worth playing most of the time, if not always. So basically avoid these auras. I don't know if I missed an aura. I can't remember if there's actually an aura I would deem playable in this format, but I don't think there is. If I missed one, mention it in the comments and I'll let you know whether or not I think it's playable. On we go to number 5. Normally I also have bad equipment as a whole category here, but for the first time in a while, I think Wizards actually printed a number of playable equipment that are actually at common and uncommon even. They're not all very good, I would say, but they all seemed like to me that they have a place where they can be effective. Haunted Cloak does not fit into that category. Usually the problem with equipment is that it's overcosted, and while you don't get quite 2-for-1, your opponent can really screw you over tempo-wise if you equip play your equipment and equip it, and then they just kill the creature you equip it to. So for a 4-mana investment, you get nothing. Haunted Cloak is actually, if it had a good effect, costed at a somewhat reasonable level, but it just doesn't. It only gives a creature Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. The kind of equipment that only gives keywords is usually not playable. This is because you have to have a creature who, on its own, is good for Haunted Cloak. You have to have something with a decent amount of power and toughness for it to even be worth putting Haunted Cloak on, and you're not always going to have that, and that's what makes Haunted Cloak a bad card. So on we go to number 4, where we have Vessel of Volatility. This is another card people will be attracted to in part because of Delirium. Getting an enchantment in your graveyard is one of the harder things to do, although there is a cycle of vessels. But this one is unplayable. I think it's the worst of the 5 vessels. They all seem to have a place. The black one's probably more of a sideboard card, but I wouldn't even side in Vessel of Volatility. I think people will be attracted to this because they will see a certain amount of mana ramp going on here, but it's really not that good of mana ramp. One-shot mana ramp is almost never playable in Limited. Sometimes it's good in Constructed. Maybe we'll see Vessel of Volatility somewhere around Constructed World. But even the amount of mana you net here isn't worth it. You play 2 to cast it and 2 to use its ability, and you add 4 red to your mana pool. So that means, unlike the other Vessels, which in the later game you can play and activate in the same turn to get some sort of useful effect, say the white one, which gives you 2 spirits, the blue one, which can help you get Delirium or help you mill your opponent, because there do seem to be somewhat legitimate mill strategies, and the blue one also draws you a card. The green one also helps you dig through your deck. Those are all things that in the later game you'd love to cast and use the ability in the same turn. Vessel of Volatility does literal nothing if you do it in the same turn, except maybe give you Delirium, because you pay 4 to add 4. Even on a later turn, it only ramps you by 2, and it does it for 1 turn. So if you use this to ramp you into a spell, especially a creature, and then your opponent just kills it, you've basically 2 for 1 yourself, and that's just not something you want to do. So avoid Vessel of Volatility. Other 4 vessels, perfectly playable. Vessel of Volatility, not so much. On we go to number 3, where I have Rotten Heart Ghoul. This is the kind of card I normally love. I am usually a very big proponent of cards that seem like walking 2 for 1s, and this seems like that's what it should be, right? But the problem in this format is that making an opponent discard a card when you don't get to choose which it is not a good thing. There's too many cards with madness in the format. I think it's a legitimate enough threat that you do not want to be playing Rotten Heart Ghoul most of the time. This is another card where I'd say never is an overstatement, but this is a card I think people might overplay without thinking about the problems of madness. And this card might be worth siding in against certain opponents. There are certain colors that are a little lighter on madness, and definitely some archetypes that have very little madness, but almost every color pair has good, strong cards in madness, and if you end up hitting one of those, Rotten Heart Ghoul is just going to be terrible, and they get to choose what they discard, so it's a real chance of that happening. Plus, it's not as much of a walking 2 for 1 as some of these cards are. We had Deadbridge Shaman recently, which is a 3-mana 3/1 with the death trigger that they discard a card. That could trade with a lot more things, just 3 powers, a lot more. And it could do it for 1 mana cheaper. And it easily got 2 for 1s. But even then, Deadbridge Shaman wasn't the most amazing card because by the later game, your opponent just either doesn't have cards in their hand or chucks a land. And Rotten Heart Ghoul doesn't even come with always giving you the upside of making your opponent discard a card that they might have wanted to play, because at times they're going to be in situations where they can discard a madness card. And I think it's best to just avoid Rotten Heart Ghoul most of the time. On we go to Pick the Brain. I'm almost never a fan of cards that cause discard effects. We recently, in Battle for Zendikar, had Transgress the Mind, and that was a card I had on my list that time around for the top 10 cards I wouldn't play, or you shouldn't play, whichever way you want to put it. And I think I was probably wrong on that one. I'm not always right with these lists, by the way, so, but probably about 90% right. There might be one card on here that I'm just whiffing on, but most of the time I do pretty well on these lists. And Pick the Brain is the kind of discard card that I just don't like. Yes, you can choose any card from their hand, and you get to exile it, so of course you avoid madness. This would be terrible. Well, maybe not terrible, because you still get to choose the card, but it's definitely better since you get to exile it. It avoids Delirium. But it still costs 3 mana, and you spend a turn doing it. You take a huge tempo hit. You can almost never play this on turn 3. I will say that this is another card where never is probably too strong of a word. That's just the catchy title of this video. But this is only a card you should probably side in against opponents who have control decks and have big 5, 6, 7 mana bombs. And this is a format that doesn't seem to have a huge number of those, so Pick the Brain's even weaker in this format than it would usually be. Also, the Delirium part almost never matters, but I could, I guess, see siding this in against someone when they play like 4 dead weights on you against you or something and really hurt you in the first game. Maybe then you're like, I'm siding in my Pick the Brain, because that's just going to be amazing to hit all their dead weights, and it will be to a degree. All right, so that's number 2, and number 1 on the list is Ember Eye Wolf. There's always a creature that gets printed that people see and they're like, well, this passes the vanilla test and it does some other things. And Ember Eye Wolf is that creature this time. We also had Grounds Creeper, of course, but there's always like a 1-mana 1/2 with an activated ability that's not really worth playing. This time around, it's a 2-mana 1/2. Think Bellows Lizard from Magic Origins. Ember Eye Wolf is basically the same thing. It's a 2-mana 1/2 with haste. People like that. On top of that, for 1 in a red, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. But the problem is, for this to even trade with most creatures, you have to make a massive mana investment. So you're probably preventing yourself from being able to play cards for a turn, things like that. Ember Eye Wolf is a wolf, and there's a red-green werewolf wolf archetype. But even then, you don't really want to be playing Ember Eye Wolf. There's no real huge incentive. It's not like support exists in this format where, yeah, if support existed, Ember Eye Wolf would actually get to be pretty good because you want to be playing 2-drops who you can support onto. Support being a mechanic in Oath of the Gatewatch drafts. But it's not around for this format, and Ember Eye Wolf is just bad. Like I said, you have to invest far too much mana to even trade with most creatures. And yes, maybe sometimes the haste will trick people into, letting down their guard, and you can play this and pump it a bunch. But we recently had Lightning Berserker, which was a card that was in Dragons of Tarkir, I believe, 1 red for a 1/1, and it had the fire breathing effect, 1 mana for +1/+0, and it also had dash. Play 1 red mana, this gains haste, return it to your hand at the end of your turn. So you could really surprise someone with that and just suddenly hit them for like 14 damage or whatever. That was the dream, right? But that's just not what's going to happen most of the time, and it's Lightning Berserker was probably a better card than Ember Eye Wolf, and it was almost never worth it in Dragons of Tarkir drafts, and Ember Eye Wolf I don't envision being worth it either. So that's my list of the top 10 cards that I don't think you should play in Shadows over Innistrad drafts. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you think I'm underrating a card. Let me know if you think there's a bad card I missed. Those are all interesting things to talk about and can help us all do better once we start drafting this format in the very near future. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.